Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here, continuing our march through the Big Ten. Today we stay with the mostly traditional Big Ten teams with number 15, Penn State Nittany Lions. Penn State was the first expansion team to the league back in the early 90s, and probably, only half our listeners even remember Penn State as anything other than a Big Ten school. Although it is safe to say it remains nothing other than a football school. So we'll talk about Mike Rhoades, who took over this team after a really bad situation in Happy Valley, which seems to be something that repeats every few years with their basketball program. He had to completely rebuild the roster after the departure of Shrewsbury to Notre Dame after a previous NCAA tournament team. And despite that, he did pretty well. They went 16-17 overall. They were 9-11 in the Big Ten, half the teams in the Big Ten, or two-thirds?
Yeah.
9-11 to 11-9. They were competitive, and he pledged to play pressure defense. They generally did. He pledged to play high tempo, and they generally did. They're a different team in the way they played than the year prior, where Penn State was really tiny and played launching threes everywhere. But they did play fast. They were number 68 in tempo. They were 71st in average length of possession. And gives every reason to think they're going to continue playing the same way. And, I guess the question will be, can they make it back into the tournament? And I don't know. Well, I guess we'll see.
Well, I think the question really is, can he continue to add talent to the equation to make Penn State more than just an occasional tournament team? Because that's really the cycle that this program has been on. I give Mike Rhoades a lot of credit for last season because, Penn State, it's refresh everybody's memory. You had Micah Shrewsbury, who was his first year and had never been a head coach. So his first year he comes in, makes Penn State very competitive. They were a tough out. And then the second year, way beyond that, that was a good team. Won a tournament game, got back to the tournament, and then won a game. And if I remember correctly, really pushed Texas in the second round before losing. So that and they were fun. I don't think it was exactly the way he wanted to build it, because if you remember, they were extremely small. But boy, that was another team. He showed he was a coach capable of playing to what his roster had, even if that wasn't an ideal picture. And so full credit to him. And then they lost him. And they let Notre Dame, not a school that has tended to emphasize basketball the way it does its other major sport. They let Notre Dame come in, a fellow high major program, and take their head coach away. And it really, I'll admit I was surprised by it, because I thought, well, maybe Penn State's finally figured out, this basketball thing can be a good deal for us. And it seemed like they had the right guy, a younger guy in Shrewsbury. He's going to be around for a while. They had him there, and all the reports suggested that Penn State simply let him walk. They didn't ante up. They didn't really try to be competitive on the money side. And again, I want to emphasize, Notre Dame did not come in with a Kansas, Kentucky style offer. They gave him a raise, but they didn't come in and just blow things out of the water. Most Big Ten schools would have matched or surpassed what they did. And then you started seeing things leak out that, Shrewsbury wasn't really happy there. it wasn't feeling a lot of love from the administration. And for me, it started to make me wonder, and I think I remember, if not talking about this here, then writing about it on the Spartan Mag board. It really made me wonder if the conference was going to have to come in and say something.
Intervention.
Because I've heard that that's actually happened in recent years in the SEC. That they had gone, the commissioner's office had gone to certain programs and said, guys, you're awash like everybody else in the league in money from our football deals, primarily. They get it from other places too, but primarily their football contract. You need to start spending money to make your basketball program competitive. And if you notice, SEC schools have gone out and really upgraded in recent years, and I'm talking across the board, in terms of head coaches. They've got, over the last few years, they've had the best collection of head coaches I can ever remember that league having. They got a number of guys who have done it, have been to Final Fours, are currently capable of doing it, and it matters. And apparently they had to go to some of the schools that were in the bottom tier, really didn't seem to spend a lot on basketball, and say, you got to start doing this. And it really made me wonder if those stories were accurate about Penn State. Is the Big Ten office going to have to do that? You know? And they hired Mike Rhoades, who had decent success at VCU. Wasn't a bad hire, but, you know, and he's a Pennsylvania native, but you just looked at it and said, well, what's going to be any different? You know, are they going to support this guy in a way they didn't support Shrewsbury? That doesn't seem likely. You know, you just had to be skeptical. But to his credit, he did. It wasn't exactly the same thing stylistically as what Shrewsbury did, but the bottom line looked very similar. Once again, Penn State last year, in a spot where you didn't necessarily expect very much out of them. They were scrappy. They played very hard. Collectively, they played in a way that the sum of the whole was better than the total of the individual parts. And they were a tough out. And the record wasn't stellar. It wasn't stellar in Shrewsbury's first year either, but 16-17 and 9-11 in that situation, I give them full credit. So now the question, and they did it again with a style. Normally I dismiss coaches when they come into this league. They say, we want to play fast. We want to go up and out of the floor, full court basketball. Well, Rhoades kind of did that. They were 68 in tempo and 71 in average length of possession. So he was able to make good largely on what he talked about at the outset in terms of how they would play. So it looks to me like he's done the first part of coming into a job like this, which is he started to establish a foundation, a style of play, a level of expectation of how guys have to play in order to get minutes in his program. And now we'll see if the other steps can fall into place, which would center around getting better talent. You know, that's what's an uncertainty, but I give him full credit. He had a nice first year, better than I thought he would.
Yeah, and I think that maybe the difference there too, with when he was talking about playing the up tempo, and like as you mentioned, we've lots of coaches come in and say that it wasn't wasn't a huge gambling sort of tempo, right? Which is different than what we've seen in the past. You know, with Richard Pitino and Brad Underwood initially coming to the league, and
I think it's sustainable. You know,
it's right.
You look at a place like Iowa's done that for years. They play fast. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not that you can't do it. It's that you can't do it in the ways that most coaches try to talk about. You can't come in and think you're going to press the hell out of people and generate turnovers, and that's going to get you into a 94-foot basketball. It doesn't work in the Big Ten. If you're going to do it, you got to do it in other ways. And so, yeah, it didn't feel like a gimmick.
So we'll talk about the players for Penn State, and we'll begin with the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. And Penn State definitely cleaned house. And so if you need your house cleaned, check out the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They're obviously in Grand Rapids, but they have a fairly large region too. So if you're anywhere in the West Michigan area, West Michigan adjacent, that even includes the capital area maybe. So you give them a call. They might come out to your house. They took care of the windows in the Capitol and the state capitol. So, these guys can really clean the windows. They do a good job. So check them out at the Squeegee Squad Grand Rapids. You find links for that on our support page at tffinots.com/support. They took care of my house and my windows. They went inside. They did the sills. They did the blinds. They did everything. It was, meticulous and the nicest guys. I mean, they were super, super friendly people. So I had no trouble having them hang out with me for a couple hours. And I can see out my windows now. Who knew? We'll begin with Kanye Clary. Clary was one of the few holdovers who came back from the Shrewsbury regime. He didn't play a whole lot before, but he was a leader of the team last season. He scored 16.7 points a game, shot 46% overall, 38% from three. But then he was suspended and dismissed from the team for unknown reasons partway through the season after about 2/3 of the way through. So he's now at Mississippi State.
Yeah, it was a really weird situation because early on, it looked like a huge success story. As you said, he really didn't play a lot under Shrewsbury in his freshman year. He stuck around, which is a rarity in this era, that you stick around playing for a new coach, somebody you didn't have any, I don't think he had any contact with Rhoades prior to Rhoades taking the Penn State job. And then he's their leading scorer, and he seems to be playing very well. But he got hurt, not a major injury, but an injury that took him out for a couple games. And Penn State, the feeling was, played better without him. And then when he came back for maybe a couple games and was not starting, and they continued to play better. And then he was suspended and he was done. And they never disclosed the reasons why. So you could speculate as to what that was. But I have to say, there didn't seem to be any feeling expressed, at least publicly, by Rhoades, that this was a departure he was particularly broken up by. And so that's another reason to give Mike Rhoades passing marks. When you got a guy who's going out scoring almost 17 a game, whatever the issues are, the temptation would be, hey, we got to have this guy on the floor. And he didn't do that. So whatever the reasons were, again, we could speculate, we don't know. But he stuck to his guns, even if it, might have put his team in a situation where they didn't have as much talent on the floor as they would have been able to have at their disposal otherwise. Clary transferred to Mississippi State, so obviously he was seen by other high majors as a guy who could potentially really help, and his play last year would certainly suggest that. But I think Penn State's okay with this because they figured out how to win with other guys.
Yeah. Yeah, I was impressed by Rhoades. I mean, there are definitely other coaches, even their players might be accessories to murder and they still end up finding their way onto the court. So,
yeah,
so,
they don't.
Yeah, right. I wasn't going to mention specific, but yeah, pretty obvious. Jameel Brown, he was another holdover. He was 6'4" wing, averaged 4 points a game in about 10 minutes, shot 35, 32, and 50. He ended up transferring to Temple, which I think says it all that he moved down to the A-10 for the Big Ten. So he'll play his last two seasons there.
Like a half step down.
Not
all the way down, but yeah, and staying in the area, we're going to a school in Philly, so he just moved slightly east. The numbers were not huge. Again, you take a guy who played 10 minutes a game, wasn't lights out as a shooter, probably not crying over his departure, but, he was a guy who was firmly in their rotation.
Then we have Kudus Wahab, 7-foot center, played at 3 different schools during his career, averaged 9.8 points a game, 7.8 rebounds a game, and 1.5 blocks. So he is no longer playing. Graduated.
Yeah, and this is and I'll say this, I think I've already mentioned this, I'll end up saying these things a few times over the course of doing these previews. There's certain guys who just sort of stand as symbols of what college basketball is in 2024. And Wahab is one of those guys. So Wahab started his career out at Georgetown, was very good, especially his sophomore year, really good. Great numbers, very productive. Then he transfers to Maryland. And he does okay, but it doesn't go as well as I think he or Maryland thought. He goes back to Georgetown. Yeah. So round 2 at Georgetown. He he's okay. Not as good as he was as sophomore, but a little better than he was at Maryland the year prior. And then he comes back to the Big Ten, plays at Penn State a year ago. This is just how it goes. You got guys, and they're all over the place. You see this, where guys are at one school, they transfer out to go somewhere else, try that out for a year, then they go back. And then sometimes, like Wahab, they leave again. He was an important, all of that aside, he mattered for Penn State. I mentioned that 2 years ago, Shrewsbury had all that success with a very weird roster. Didn't have much size, and a lot of times, he was playing with essentially a glorified wing at the center spot.
Yeah.
Wahab meant that Rhoades had a different option available to him. He was a legitimate Big Ten size center. He had played in the league, had also played in the Big East, obviously, so he had a lot of high major experience, and the numbers were decent. 9.8 points, 7.8 rebounds, 1.5 blocks. That's all solid production. And at 7 feet, he gave them a guy who at least physically could match up with centers around this conference. We've talked often in the last few years about how the Big Ten seems to be bucking the trend in basketball at all levels for things to maybe get a little smaller. That hasn't been the case in the Big Ten. And so when you have a 7-footer at your disposal, that could be a real advantage. And Wahab gave Penn State that, gave him a legitimate presence down low. And again, the numbers were solid. So I would say that was a successful portal addition, despite his kind of wild career ride.
Another player who is no longer with the team is Ray Kwawindis Mitchell. He's a 6'5" wing who transferred in from Kansas City. Didn't end up playing a whole lot at Penn State. It just averaged 9 minutes a game in 22 games.
Yeah, look, Rhoades took that job, and it was complete roster overhaul time, right? He was left no choice. They were losing some guys who were out of eligibility from Shrewsbury's last team, and then, of course, other guys opted to leave, which happens frequently when there's coaching change. So they just had to bring in guys. And when you're in this mode, and you're going to see programs in the league this year who fit this. I think USC is one, Michigan is another, where they're just bringing in, 8 guys, 9 guys through the portal. It's sort of and coaches wouldn't like this characterization, but in some ways it's a let's throw a bunch at the wall and see what sticks kind of thing. And I think that's sort of what it was with Penn State. Mitchell was a guy who didn't stick.
And then Demetrius Lilly is a 6'9", 260-pound big man. He ends up transferring to LaSalle for next year, where he only last year averaged 2.8 points a game and 2.7 rebounds a game.
Yeah, again, a move down to the A10 level. I would think, and I don't know this, but just looking at it from the outside, I would think this was a little disappointing, because when you've got a guy with that kind of size, and he did show a little bit of production and is still young. You got a couple more years with him. That would be a guy you'd want to stick around and see if maybe you can develop him into something. But it's also not significant enough that you're heartbroken about the loss. So we'll see if it goes better for him playing with the Explorers.
Certainly the challenge with a situation like Rhoades has, two. One is that you're getting a bunch of transfers in, and there are people who've done the transfer, right? So the barrier to transferring is lower. Like, I've already done this. I know how it works. And so they're more likely to leave. And then, of course, to try and get that stability, like you mentioned before, can you, when you get players you want, are you able to retain them? And so that's the thing, like Ben Johnson's never been able to do over Minnesota.
Yep.
Moving on to Leo Boyle, 6'7", 230-pound forward, who transferred in from Lafayette. He averaged 2 points a game in about 11 minutes, shooting 32, 28, and 77.
Yeah, again, they had to add bodies last year, and O'Boyle played a role, but wasn't hugely significant. And he's done in terms of eligibility.
So for returning players, they actually have some, which is good for them. Starting with Ace Baldwin. So he was probably the biggest reason they were pretty good. He came in from VCU, so he followed Rhoades in to Pennsylvania. He didn't play real well early, but then he sort of kind of figured things out. He ended up averaging 14.2 points a game, 39, 33, and 83 shooting, and averaged 6 assists a game to just 2.6 turnovers a game, so better than 2-1 on that average. And he also had almost 3 steals a game, which is also big for the team.
Yeah, this is a huge, huge guy for Penn State, for Mike Rhoades. And it seemed obvious that was going to be the case when he opted to come over with his coach from VCU last year. He had been very good. I think he was a first-team all A-10 guy at VCU.
Yeah.
So at that, and then he's point guard, well, that's a great place to start, right? But then, as you say, initially it wasn't going smoothly. And early on last season, as we talked about, Clary was the guy who was really playing well. But I think what happened is Baldwin got his feet underneath him in terms of what it takes at the Big Ten level, and it became his team. And that was better for Penn State as a team. The 33% from three is not a great number, but it's much better than it was early on. He raised it to that by shooting much better in the second half of the season. And that was the worst percentage of his career. They think he can be better than that this season. And then you look at everything else, the playmaking. I mean, 6 assists, better than a 2-to-1 A to TO ratio. That's really good. Tells you, one, that he's able to play efficiently, but two, maybe even more importantly, he's able to play efficiently while being dynamic. 6 assists, a lot of assists at college level. You mentioned the steals, almost 3 a game, 2.7. That's important. He's the key to this team. I mean, having a guy going into his 5th year who's obviously proven he can get it done at this level. I mean, I think, we just recently talked about Boo Buie at Northwestern, and he was a guy that was really able to take advantage of that 5th year. And his additional maturity that he had gained really showed through in terms of the way he was able to play. Well, Baldwin's a guy who also fits in that category, in my opinion. I'm not saying he's going to quite be what Boo Buie was, but you would think as a 5th-year guy, Baldwin's ready to have a really good season. And, man, when you could say that about your point guard, that's a great place for your team to start.
For sure. Yeah, and I mean, super impressive that he was averaging more steals than turnovers. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's a really good stat you like for your player. A lot more possessions. Then we'll move on to Zach Hicks. He's a 6'8" senior who transferred in from Temple. He was a really good, solid player for him last year, averaged 8.4 points a game and 3.9 rebounds a game, shooting 35, 34, and 81.
Yeah, and, solid numbers, solid contributions. As I said, they had a lot of guys they brought in. Some of them stuck, some of them didn't. Hicks is one of the guys who stuck. The numbers aren't eye-popping, but they're solid. And he's one of those guys that I think what they like about him is his versatility. He could play some 4, he can play some on the wing. They'd like the shooting to be a little bit better, but the versatility and his ability to defend a variety of types of players, it's going to be valuable no matter what. I think he's definitely in line to be a starter.
Then we have Nick Kern, 6'6" senior, who came over from VCU as well with Rhoades. He averaged 8.7 points a game and 3.9 rebounds a game, shooting 55, 32, and 67.
Yeah, mostly an interior guy. He doesn't take a ton of threes, but despite only being 6'6", he gets a lot done with his motor, his energy. He's another guy. He and Hicks, I think, are similar players in that way, that they don't put up eye-popping stats, but they're guys who do a lot of things that help you win games. So, again, whether it's in a starting role or a key reserve role, Kern's going to play a lot.
6'8" transfer from North Carolina, Puff Johnson's next. I think, this guy, I think they hoped they were going to get a little bit more from last year, but he had largely played a very minor role at North Carolina, despite being I think he was a pretty high-level recruit, if
he
I
was.
recall.
Top 100 guy.
Top 100, yeah, right. So he averaged 7.3 points a game and 3.1 rebounds a game. Not too shabby. He shot 42, 33, and 79.
Yeah, look, I think there's a better deep shooter locked away in there somewhere. North Carolina felt that too. It hasn't happened yet. That doesn't mean it won't happen this year. He'll continue to get chances because there's that potential. And they want to take, a program like Penn State, you have that leeway. His expectations aren't huge.
Yeah.
He's like, okay, we're going to keep giving this guy some opportunities. Now, eventually that stops. But, he was able to do enough other things that I think they can continue to roll the dice with him. But I would say he was the guy in their portal class, other than Baldwin, that they had the highest hopes for becoming an impact guy. And he was maybe the fifth best or fourth best guy in their portal class. So they'll hope for a little better return this year.
Final returning players, DeMarco Dunn, 6'5" wing, came from also North Carolina, averaged 6.8 points a game on 40, 37, and 74. And he definitely played more later in this year after Clary departed.
Yeah, again, same thing as with Johnson, former top 100 recruit from North Carolina, came in with some expectations, but he did a little better at making good on them. And again, his total numbers aren't reflective of where he ended the season because he really picked up when Clary left. He emerged as the number 2 guy in that backcourt next to Baldwin, and that seemed to work a little better. It was a little more harmonious, and they were winning a little more with that combination. So they need him to shoot the 3 well. 37% is pretty good. I would say they would take that kind of efficiency if it's coming with higher volume. They need him to do that. But I think it's possible that he's got another level left to hit offensively.
Before we go over the newcomers for the Penn State Nittany Lions, I'd like to just remind you to check out where other new products are coming online all the time, and that's Nudge Printing. Nudge Printing, a great Spartan, started by great Spartans, Gabe and Brittany. They make everything in Portland, Michigan, so here locally, and they have they're one of the few people who actually have branding rights for Michigan State gear. So I get officially Michigan State stuff from their shop. You can go to nudgeprinting.com to find out the massive selection they have. And they have really high quality stuff, screen printed, so lasts multiple washes, and super comfortable, soft, very breathable. Like I've got a couple of their sweatshirts. They're just fantastic. So can't go wrong with Nudge Printing. 20% off if you type in Final Four just as one word in checkout. So check it out. You can find that as our support page as well. So first newcomer will be Eli Rice, 6'7" wing, transferred in from Nebraska. I hardly remember the name, but it's because he didn't play much. He only played 17 games for the Huskers. He averaged 4.2 points a game on 41, 37, and 72 shooting. So I imagine they expect that and a little bit more maybe this year.
Yeah, I think so. Limited in terms of how much he really contributed at Nebraska, but you like the potential, especially with the shooting. And Penn State's a team that can use some shooting. The fact that he's got good size for the position at 6'7" also helps. So it'll be interesting to see. But I would think Rice is going to have every opportunity to play a role this year. And they would hope be a guy they can continue to build with because he's got 3 years left.
Then we have Xavier transfer, 6'9", 230-pounder, Kachi Zay. Averaged 2.5 points a game and 2.5 rebounds a game in about 10 minutes. But he's only a sophomore, so plenty of time to develop and improve on those numbers.
Similar situation to Rice's, okay production, but you have to keep in mind he was a true freshman.
Yeah.
And so that's enough to show potential. I've mentioned that it might be a little disappointed to have lost Lilly, who was a big man who didn't set the world on fire, but at least showed a little bit of potential and had size you can't teach. A little bit disappointed maybe to see him leave. But getting a kid like this to come in with similar numbers at a roughly similar level, Big East, makes up for that. And there's potential here. So what you're hoping is, all right, we're getting him as a sophomore. We've got some time for him to continue to develop into maybe first being a reliable rotation guy and a contributor, and then later something more than that. That would be the hope. Of course, you got to retain him, but Penn State with Wahab gone, they need somebody or multiple somebodies to step up at the 5. I think he'll be one of the guys that gets a chance to fill that gap.
Freddie Dion the fifth, a 6'5" guard with some ability to play point guard. Played sparingly as a redshirt freshman for Tennessee, who they were a pretty good team, obviously, last year. Only averaging 1.7 points a game, but only showed up in 17 games. Top 100 recruit out of high school. So, I guess it's sort of like Dunn and Johnson from North Carolina. There's expectations that might be more than what he's shown so far.
Absolutely. And I think what happened to him, people at Tennessee seemed excited about him. I remember that in prepping for that exhibition game that Michigan State played against Tennessee at the Breslin. I remember looking at their roster, and he had redshirted as a true freshman. They were really excited about him. And then what I think happened to him is they had a portal class. Everybody remembers Dalton Connect, but they had some other guys too. And there just weren't opportunities for real minutes. So he kind of got caught up in a numbers game with more experienced, more proven guys ahead of him in the pecking order. Doesn't diminish the potential. And you're right to compare him to guys like Dunn and Johnson. It's a smart way for Rhoades to go because, Penn State has never proven to be a place where you could reliably think you're going to be able to bring in a bunch of top 100 recruits out of high school, right? Hasn't ever, multiple coaches, it's never been that kind of program. But this is what the portal is opening as a possibility, is to take chances on some guys who were regarded that way, and it just didn't pan out at their previous spot. And so you're at least operating from the perspective of, well, we've got potential here for somebody to be a really good player. And I think that's what the case is here. Now, they don't need him to walk into a starting spot necessarily. That's the other thing that's nice, is there's an opportunity here for Dion to, maybe just play 15 minutes or so a night this year and give them some help off the bench, but show that he's got the potential to develop into something more down the line, like next year when Baldwin's gone, and maybe they need him to be a starting point guard. I think he's going to play. I don't think there's much question about that. We'll see at what level he plays, but if I were a Penn State fan, this is the kind of addition I'd be excited about because it's a realistic way, and a sustainable way right now, at least. Okay, he's proving he can get these kind of second chance guys who are sort of lottery tickets,
Then we'll talk about another one of those potential fives. That's Miles Goodman, 6'11", 225-pound freshman from Seattle, top 100 recruit, and probably the biggest name that Rhoades got for this recruiting class.
Yeah, and I turn right around and say, oh, they did get a top 100 guy. but Penn State historically as a program has not done that. Right, and if Rhoades is able to do that consistently, hey, hats off. I'm not sure that landing one guy is proof of that. And he was a lower tier top 100 guy. We're not talking, Miles Goodman was not in contention for the McDonald's All-American game. Let's get that straight. But look, it's a good addition. And he's got a path. They need somebody to step in at the 5. So he's got competition. Zeb would be a guy who will compete. There's another guy we'll talk about in a second who might be able to compete for that role. But the opportunity's there for Miles Goodman to play minutes and as a freshman, and I would expect that he will. They really like his defensive instincts and hands. Man, if those are two strengths for you, that's a great place to start. If you can catch the ball and you can guard people, you're going to be able to play at most places. Offensively, they think he's a little bit raw, but has the potential to develop. Again, if the defense and hands translate right away, he's going to play a rotation role, and I would venture a guess he has an opportunity to start. Sure. The other caveat would be 6'11", 225. If that's accurate, you could see maybe a need for some additional strength, that could be a problem early on. But again, they're in a situation where they need guys to play minutes at that spot. So that's probably not going to prevent him from seeing the floor. It just might prevent him from impacting the way he might otherwise be able to.
Shrewsbury would have been excited about all these guys who were this big this last year.
Yeah.
Didn't have any of this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a totally different deal.
Speaking of big players, we'll go to the next one, who's Yannick Conan Niederhauser, 6'10", 215-pound transfer from Northern Illinois, scored 7.3 points a game and 4.4 rebounds a game, and shot 54, 29, and 61. Total aside, but like you saw the movie Three Amigos with Martin Short.
Yeah.
Wasn't Niederhauser, was that the name of Martin Short's character?
Well, I don't recall.
Little Nettie, I
be.
thought. Oh,
Might be.
Anyway, go ahead.
Been a long time since I've seen that. Good. Well, he's not short. That's one big difference.
He's not Martin.
Now, 215 is a little light, but 6'10", that helps. Has starting experience, and granted it's in the MAC, but still. The other thing they got to like is he averaged a little over 2 blocks per game. So what that says is that he should be able to give you some interior defense. And when the other thing would be, when you're talking about your other two options, a second-year player and a true freshman, it's nice to have somebody who's actually got some experience under his belt, even if it's at the mid-major level. I would expect that Niederhauser is going to play some minutes. I don't know how big the role is going to be, how those minutes are going to get distributed, but I would think he's going to play. Some at the 5, maybe some at the 4, but I would say more likely at the 5. So again, a nice pickup, gives you a different flavor. But as you say, this is any of these guys Shrewsbury would have killed for just in terms of their size alone.
Yeah, for those actually interested, it was Ned Niederlander was the name of the character.
Okay,
Pretty
there we
close.
go. Close.
Pretty close. Close. We on to Javan Carter, 6'2" freshman guard from Tennessee. He's got some point guard skills as well. So, you know, as you mentioned, there's possibility, at least with backup minutes on this team for the point.
Maybe. I think Dion probably takes most of those up, and I think they're gonna look. Baldwin's a guy who's probably gonna play somewhere in the low to mid 30s.
Yeah,
ideally. But you never know. And you know, the rest of the freshman class, I mean, Goodman was definitely the headliner. The other guys are all players that, you know, are not top 100 types, so it's hard to know how it translates. We'll see how it comes along for Carter, but definitely a guy they think could be a point guard down the line, so we'll see if he's able to earn a rotation spot.
Next recruit is Dominic Stewart, 6'5" wing, played some ball in prep school with Goodman, and is from Maryland. So, you know, I guess we'll see what he turns out to be.
Same similar deal with Carter, you know. They see him as a guy with good ball skills, has a nice jumper, decent handle, decent playmaking. If all that translates in year one, maybe he's got a chance to earn some minutes, but hard to know until we see it. There's definitely some rotation minutes available, though, for this team.
And finally, for newcomers, 6'7" freshman from Canada, Hudson Ward, not the Hudson Bay, right? Some potential versatile forward, play some as a big wing, maybe.
Yeah, and as he matures physically, they think he might also be able to play some at the 4. I think when you look at this roster and you figure that, you know, they've got guys like Hicks and Kern and Johnson who are all similarly sized. And then they add Eli Rice from Nebraska. It's kind of hard to see a likely path for Ward to see regular minutes. So I would expect this is more of a developmental year for him.
All right. And so then, much like the screen is not a very glamorous part of basketball, gutters are not a very glamorous part of your home. However, they're really important. Without them, you're not going to be successful. Same thing with good screeners. So make sure you've got the right gutters in your house or your business, and it keeps the water away from the house. And there's no better person to take care of that than the brothers Just Do Gutters. You can find ways to contact them either on the west side or the east side of the state at our support page at thefinalfoursonotheschedule.com/support. They can clean them out. They can replace them. They can repair them. Whatever you need done, they can do it. And I was just fixing my undersealing underneath my deck, which is fantastic. They also do that. So if you want to add a layer of dryness underneath a deck you might have at your home if you've got some room underneath. It's a great way to add some extra square footage for storage, or just to add an extra room. We have like a little shuffleboard under our deck, so it's kind of nice. It stays nice and dry, and snow pretty much off most of the winter. So which player would you say most teams need to keep in the gutter for Penn State this year?
Oh, Ace Baldwin.
Yeah,
for sure.
Pretty easy one there. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the guy who has all conference potential, honestly.
Right, yeah. So looking at this team, you have them ranked 15th, which is, obviously near the bottom of the Big Ten. As we say with all these teams, there's potential there. I feel like there's a little bit less potential here than maybe even we had Northwestern before, but, I guess, again, just how it all fits together. Overall, though, looking at the program, Rhoades seems like a good hire. I mean, at least he did really well last year with nothing. And so you kind of wonder what he's going to be able to do with something.
Yeah, and I think there's a good argument for the idea that the talent level he's got is better than it was in year one, which is what you want to see. When you look at guys that have built programs in recent years in the Big Ten, so Chris Collins would be one, Steve Pikiell would be another, where they took programs that have historically been doormats and got them to be competitive. That is what happened, and it happens at different pace depending upon the guy at the job. But the idea is, as I said, you as early you establish your foundation, the way you're going to play, your level of expectation for your program, and then the next step is you try to upgrade the talent. Well, I think Rhoades did the first part last year. We'll see if it remains consistent. I guess it's hard to say that job is done after just 1 year, but
Yeah.
He came in talking about them playing fast, playing hard, and they did that. And so if that continues, then you'd say, okay, the first part's done. You've got your foundation built. Now you need to build on that foundation with better players. And I think he's already showing signs of maybe being a guy who can do that. We've mentioned the path he seems to be taking primarily is sort of second chances on guys who were pretty highly regarded, pretty heavily recruited out of high school, and for whatever reason, it didn't work. The North Carolina guys who brought in last year, those guys had multiple years of opportunities at North Carolina, and they just weren't able to earn a role. With Dion, I think it's a little different because I just think the deck was stacked so thoroughly against him earning minutes at Tennessee that you can't really even make a judgment as to whether he disappointed or not. There just wasn't ever going to be a situation where he was going to be able to play a big role. There were just too many more experienced guys in front of him. So I like that approach. I think that's something that, a guy who's coaching at Penn State could manage to do with some regularity. That could be a niche that he fills. It's also interesting he was able to land a top 100 player. Again, not many of those over the course of time at Penn State. They occasionally were able to do that, but not often. And I think that there's a chance that they got really lucky with this hire, because I was very negative after they lost Shrewsbury. I just thought, hey, this is proof positive. This guy is coming off a year where they get to the tournament, they win a game when they get there. There's every reason and you could see how he was starting to build his program as well. He was showing signs of being able to recruit well at Penn State with high school guys. And then they just showed no interest in really being competitive to try and keep him. I thought, well, that's it. They are fine with just focusing on football and spring football, and basketball will do what it does, and they'll roll the balls out. They'll play in front of 17 people at Bryce Jordan, and that's that. And I still don't think we've resolved all those questions affirmatively, but they might have gotten lucky despite themselves in getting a guy like Rhoades, who is indicating that he at least has a chance to be good, and he's a Pennsylvania guy, so he might be willing to stay there longer even if some of that stuff about support or lack thereof is true. So it's an interesting situation. I actually think you could squint, and if enough things broke the right way, you could see this team maybe being in position to compete for a tournament bid. I think that's a little unlikely, but I don't rule it out. I think there's more talent here than there is at Northwestern. That's why I've picked and in particular, that they have a proven, true point guard as their best player. That's always going to be a differentiator for me. If you've got strength in the backcourt, man, that means a lot. And I think Penn State may have that. So it's going to be an interesting team to watch. They could certainly stand to shoot the ball a lot better than they did last year. That would help. Maybe be a little more consistent in some ways defensively. They've obviously got to have some of those guys we mentioned at the 5 step up and at least be functional. Because they had a veteran occupying that spot last year, which really helped. They don't have that now. So there's some question marks, but you could see the potential for some answers. So I think they're going to be an interesting team to watch. And I actually, God help me for saying this, but I think their future might be, by Penn State standards, decently bright.
Well, and I think the one thing about basketball in comparison to football, and I recognize Penn State obviously is a football school first, and all, I can't imagine it ever not being that way. But you can really have a great experience from a fan, from a college, from a student standpoint, with these games. Basketball, because just the nature of the arena can be small, it's more intimate, it's indoors, so you can kind of be crazy, you can wear whatever you want. I mean, I just think that it's a better fan experience than football in some respects. And you also see that like with ice hockey too. Like you can see, I mean, I remember when I was in school, I thought ice hockey was the best place watching sports. That is, I thought, better than football and basketball. So anyway, I just think there's opportunities for schools that, you may not have to put out the best team on the floor, but you can make a fun atmosphere, even though you may not be the best. And I think, Rutgers and certainly Nebraska is a really good example of that, where it just looks like a fun time, even though, you may not be the best team.
Well, and you would think that would have some impact. And that's why the Shrewsbury thing was just so jarring to me.
Yeah.
I really thought they would have recognized all the things that you're saying and seen the value in it. They gave Pat Chambers a long leash, right? And
yes,
he was a guy who got really screwed by COVID in a way, because his team was on track that year to be in the tournament and it didn't happen. And then he had some other stuff, some other weird, behavioral stuff come out that ultimately cost him his job. But, on the one hand, you looked at it at the time, I did at least, and thought, well, they're showing a real commitment to him to allow him to see this thing through. And he actually recruited pretty well by Penn State standards there. On the other, you could kind of, in retrospect, look at it as benign indifference that he was allowed to keep that job. I forget how many years he was there. I think it was like 7 or 8, and never get a tournament bid. And if he hadn't had the behavioral stuff come to light, probably would have kept the job. So you can interpret that as either being willing to stick it out or, we don't really care. As long as it's not embarrassing, we don't care. And it's just hard to understand why. Why would you look at a sport that, as you say, can have really positive effects on the perception of your school? And nobody's reinventing the wheel here. Nobody's splitting the atom with a successful basketball program. But enough administrators talk about this that you can take it as a fact that big time athletics, the two major sports, and basketball is one of those, serve as a front porch of sorts to the university. And why would you not look to take advantage of those opportunities? You know, when they went through this thing with Shrewsbury, there was a lot of talk about how there were elements in the athletic department that just had no interest in doing any more than they were currently doing with regard to the basketball program, that any additional funding, resources, et cetera, should go to football. Now, look, I like football too, but that's just incredibly short-sighted in my view. And if that truly is the attitude within enough of the powers that be in that school's athletic department and their, board of trustees or whatever they call it, that's not great. I mentioned the bit about the league maybe needing to have a come to Jesus moment with Penn State. They might still need to do that. Let's say Mike Rhoades somehow squeezes out a tournament bid this year. Hey, Mike Rhoades could be a guy who's a candidate for other jobs. I wouldn't rule that out, that doesn't happen, especially if he continues to progress. So what do? Do they repeat what they did with Shrewsbury? I don't see how the conference can let them get away with that. Now, how much leverage you can really apply, I don't know, but you could certainly start publicly embarrassing them. That would be one thing. I mean, it's really, really hard for me to understand, other than it's a cultural thing at Penn State. They've never really cared about basketball. And so the desire and the willingness to do the things necessary to make this a sustainably good or at least competitive program just don't exist with enough gravitas within the context of that university for that to happen. I don't know. That might be the case, but as you mentioned, you look at a place like Nebraska. Nebraska has never won. Penn State's ahead of Nebraska in this sense. Penn State's actually won an NCAA tournament game. Nebraska has never won an NCAA tournament game in the entire history of the program. They've been there several times, haven't ever won a game. Yet you look at that environment that they get. And even during the years where Hoiberg was just rolling out a miserable product. And it's okay, this is what a school where football is first, second, and third, but they're still willing to do what's necessary to try to compete. And people care. Penn State, I tend to think people don't care because the school historically has not done what's necessary to compete. So what would happen if they did? But bringing it back to this team, I think there's potential here. We'll see what Rhoades is able to do. I still think he's probably going to come up a little bit short of a tournament bid, but I don't rule out their ability to compete for a spot. There's enough reason to think that could happen here for one of the 14 Penn State basketball fans to be optimistic.
They've already dropped by 3 since the show started. It's going the wrong way for Penn State.
17? Yeah. Well,
there'll be a dozen before you know it.
That lighting in Bryce Jordan, it's hard to get an accurate count sometimes.
There could be a dozen up there in the rafters. We don't even see.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, you never know. Who's on the second deck? I don't know. Never see it.
It is funny why they even have a second deck.
When is the last time we had a camera shot of the upper deck at Bryce Jordan? I don't know that I've ever seen it. Does it exist?
I think they just use it for graduation.
The old saw about, a tree falling in the forest with no one there to hear it. Did it make a sound? If we never see a second deck at Bryce Jordan, does it actually exist?
That's a good question. Yeah, maybe it's full of a bunch of, priests or something who have taken a vow of silence, and so they've been there the whole time. We just didn't know.
What's really funny about that, too, and I don't know how many Michigan State fans are aware of this. Bryce Jordan is modeled on the Breslin Center. That was what they used. And I've never been to a game there because getting to Happy Valley is not exactly right. It's not exactly an easy trip. But to confirm it, but you could see it on television. You could notice, okay, that makes sense. The way it's laid out, it kind of looks like that. But that is my understanding, that they modeled it on Breslin. But man, you could not, it just goes to show you architectural plans don't really have anything to do with how a building's actually going to function, right? You
Right.
could not have more diametrically opposed environments than those two.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, whether it's a sustainable program or not, all I know is that in order for our show to be sustainable, we need continued support from our listeners. We really appreciate it. You can find ways to help support us at our support page. And there are a number of people who do that right now. And we want to thank all those of you on Patreon who do that. Specifically at the Machine Cleaves level, Bill Church, Brian O'Donnell, Michael Bosnick, Chad Hickey, Draymond Green supporters, Adam Walzak, Dan Rankin, James Benton, Jim L., David Brame, Paul Marsh, Scott Driscoll, and Dan Dranak, and all the Scott Skiles supporters, as well as Rich Wagenheim and Kenneth Kremet on Substack. If you appreciate what we do, you can do one-time gifts or recurring gifts. You can find all of that at our support page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. Thanks so much to all of you. And until next time, in the number 14 team in the Big Ten, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.